Um, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Thun Theara, and I'm going to be informal and call him Theara since I know him pretty well. Theara is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Kyoto's prestigious Center for Southeast Asian Studies. So it's very early in the morning there in Kyoto. So we especially want to thank him for, for joining us under these circumstances. Theara has had an amazingly international training and career so far. After completing his BA at RUPP in Phnom Penh, he went on to do an MA degree at Chulalongkorn University, supported by a Rockefeller Foundation scholarship, and then on to do PhD studies in history at the National University of Singapore with a Harvard Yenching NUS fellowship that enabled him to move between NUS and Harvard for his doctoral studies. His first postgraduate fellowship before Kyoto was as a research fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies in Leiden. I had the honor of serving as one of Theara's dissertation committee members at NUS in 2018. And after reading his dissertation on history making in Cambodia between the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries, I knew that I was in the presence of the next major scholar of Cambodian history to follow David Chandler. Theara's work treats a range of topics, and he's continuously posing creative, new, and path-breaking questions that he'd like to answer. So I hope his career lasts 500 years because he's got a lot of research interests. His current book manuscript, Textual Authority and Epistemology, Texts, History, and Intellectuals of Cambodia, 1850 to 1960, expands on his dissertation to examine history writing practices, genres, and concerns of Cambodian intellectuals in the modern period. This is a big book in the making, one that will treat the much neglected work and ideas of Cambodian writers and intellectuals and help us understand how Cambodians perceived, demythologized, and simultaneously enchanted the past and actively sought to decolonize and shape the present and future. I'm very excited about the book and can't wait to see it. I think it's getting close.
It's getting close.
Theara has also contributed some important work in the area of digital history that I urge you to look at if you haven't already. Khmer Rouge History, the app, it's an amazing app and digital history of the Khmer Rouge produced by the Bopana Media Archives and Library in Phnom Penh, and Theara was one of the historian writers for this incredible project. The app, which came out several years ago, is not only an excellent resource on Khmer Rouge history, but I think for many of us who've been watching the job market and digital humanities recently, it's also a model for other scholars of highly effective public-facing digital humanities work. Theara has a number of other articles out in journals such as Critical Asian Studies and the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. They're too numerous to list, but I want to especially highlight his most recent article, Ethnic Vietnamese and the Khmer Rouge, the Genocide and Race Debate, and his contributions in this piece and other thinking he's doing that are helping us think more deeply about the history and politics of race and ethnicity in Southeast Asia. This is an area of future research for Theara, along with new transnational and comparative research on Southeast Asian manuscript cultures. I'm excited to hear this newly completed chapter today. So let's all join in some virtual clapping to welcome Dr. Thun Theara.
All right. So thank you very much, Professor Ann Hansen, for your very kind introduction and for your mentorship for the past several years. So I've been very please, very grateful to be working with you, to be listening to your advice. And, I keep using your suggestions and put into my scholarship. So thank you very much. And actually, this presentation was, I need also to thanks to Professor Ann Hansen, who initiated the ideas, giving me the floor to share my my new chapters, which I just finished writing. It's gonna be part of my future book manuscripts. So the chapter you will see more during the following slides. So my presentation today will focus on post-colonial nationalist historiography of Cambodia, with some implications to the broader Southeast Asian regions. So as I explained earlier, this presentation is actually based on a chapter of my ongoing monograph on text, history, and intellectual of Cambodia between the 1850s and the 1970s. I simply entitled the chapter Post-Independent Nationalist Historiography. So my intention is to examine history texts they were produced between the 1940s and the 1970s with two major intentions in mind. I want to explore the changes in social, political, and historical landscapes of post-independent Cambodia through history writings. And another intention is to explore how local scholars responded to Marxist and other regional historiographical trends that took place after the period of decolonization. So in Cambodia, for the Cambodian context, there are four major themes during this period. So the first theme was the idea of historicizing the state religion among Cambodian Buddhist communities and scholars, which took place between the 1940s and the 1950s. Then when Sihanouk came to power in 1955, there was another themes which dominant national historical debate during those years, which focused on the role of the monarchy and the role of Sihanouk as a prominent leader. When Sihanouk was removed from power in 1970, another theme emerged, which emphasized ethnic essentialist historical approach, which followed by the last one, pretty much under the Khmer Rouge regime between 1975 and 1978. So my presentation will highlight these four themes, which will follow by a discussion on the parallel to broader regional historiographical trends of post-independent Southeast Asia. So when we talk about historicizing the state religion in Cambodia, we need to talk about a prominent local scholar by the name Grosseim. Grosseim became established as a prominent Cambodian scholar since the 1920s, but his writing has lasted for the entire colonial period. So he was one of the very early Cambodian intellectuals who debates, who examined how Buddhism and Hinduism became established in Cambodia during the early century EC. So his writing, because it took place during the period of colonization, Buddhism, his writing did not emphasize the dominant role of Buddhism. Instead, it emphasized the coexistence of Hinduism and Buddhism, which emerged in Cambodia during the early century, and how the religion evolved until the present time. His writing mostly appeared in the very popular writing platform known as the Kampuchea Sorya magazine, the oldest, longest, most popular Cambodian magazines between the colonial period and the post-independent years. So when Buddhism was promoted as the state religion in 1947, so more and more scholarly discussions on the state religion started to emerge. There are many publications So there also a story of the Jakarta. I brought in the photo here because it's interesting in the sense that the person inside on the cover page of this story of the Jakarta looks quite similar to King Sihanouk. So it just catch my eye. So I think it would be interesting to share here. So, but Buddhism became the state religion in 1945, followed by the, it was written in the constitution. So when Cambodia got independence from the French in 1953, there are more and more local scholarships talks about how Buddhism became established and evolved in Cambodia, and how the religion emerged to be the state religion in the country. So those writings appears in the Mật Sala Ballet magazine, or French of the Ballet School magazine. So there are many short texts, talking about this subject. There are also some book, a prominent one, the history of Buddhism in Cambodia. The book was originally published in early 1950s, but it was reprinted in 1957. There are many other texts, other Khmer texts which talk about Buddhism in the country. So these publications, they focus on two major themes. One, they emphasize the dominant role of Buddhism since the early century, because Buddhism became such a very important themes of the country during those years. So the theme was all about the story of how Buddhism came into Cambodia. Another interesting aspect is that they hardly share any agreement on how the religion emerged, because some writers claimed that the religion came from Java, while others said it came from Burma, others said it came from India. So there are different perspectives, different arguments on how the religion became established in the kingdom. So because of this, I think during the 250-year anniversary of Buddhism, there was a very important history text distributed during the anniversary, during the celebration. So the text was written by a prominent Cambodian Buddhist scholar by the name Pangkat. Pangkat was a linguistic who studied quite a number of topics concerning Cambodian religion, culture, history, inscriptions, so many other publications during the post-independent period. So Pangkat wrote a very important text on history of Cambodian Buddhism, which was published in May 1957, and the text was for distributing to followers, to people who came to participate in the 250th anniversary celebration in Phnom Penh. So the text was reprinted by the Buddhist Institute two more times, in 1958, in 1961. So which make it very important. I think this is the most important work in Khmer on history of the state religion ever produced during the post-independent period. So this is the reprinted version in 1961. And the text was forwarded by Hu Tat, who was another prominent Cambodian Buddhist leaders during the post-independent period. So that's why it makes a Pangkat's book become very appealing, very influential in Cambodia during those years. So reading the content of this text, there are three major themes which I would like to highlight here. First, the text or the book display heavy nation-centric and nationalistic view in content and narrative trajectory. So it's quite similar to other nationalist history writing across the region. So the notion of a nationalist view, nation-centric perspective happened throughout the content of this book. Another major theme is that the book depicts Cambodian Buddhism as the descendant of Indian Buddhism and hub of Buddhist missionary efforts in the region. So the book also highlights how Cambodia actually spread Buddhism to China, which according to in-house discussion, there is no enough evidence to make such claim. At the same time, the book also promotes Sihanouk's legitimacy as the only Buddhist, promote Sihanouk's Buddhist kingships, and also try to endorse his Sihanouk's foreign policy on neutrality that was put in place during his era. So in this sense, it seems from the Buddhist, from the Sangha community during those years, it seems Sihanouk enjoys a very wide support from the Buddhist community, Buddhist leaders, including intellectuals. So it's allowed Prince Sihanouk to establish himself as the only legitimate Buddhist ruler in the kingdom during those years. So there are many other publications that show that Sihanouk enjoyed support from the Buddhist communities. So as you can see the picture on the left hand side is the photo of Sihanouk's father, who gave a keynote speech during the 250th anniversary celebration. And a photo picture on the left, Sihanouk handed over relics of the Buddha to Supreme Patriarch Junat in 1955. So when scholarly discussion talks about history of Cambodia, the state religion, the real outcome, the real benefit actually went to Prince Sihanouk. So when we talk about nationalist historiography under his regime, there are several key aspects that I would like to highlight here, but I also want to point out that when he took over the country in 1955, Sihanouk actually became the first Cambodian ruler who utilized history scholarship produced during the colonial period. As I discussed in the other chapters of my monograph, I argue that Cambodian kings before Sihanouk, they actually did not agree with what the French said about Cambodian history. So they actually ignore what the French say. So Sihanouk was the first Cambodian ruler who actually capable of utilizing colonial era history scholarship to promote his rule. And when you look at nationalist historiography under his regime, there are several aspects that we can draw from. First, those scholarship kind of personalize Sihanouk as one of the great Khmer rulers who were capable of bridging contemporary Cambodia with its glorious past, because it talks about how Sihanouk, constructed roads, schools, railway, hospitals. So whenever this construction came, it was the idea of linking it to the infrastructure that was built during the Angkor period. So a very interesting observation from Anthony Bernard in 1990, he said that Sihanouk personalized Khmer history by projecting himself as the reincarnation of Angkor ruler Jayavarman VII, and had his profile photographically compared to that of the great emperor. So that is the historical aspects of the Angkor period. So during the post-independent period, during the post-Angkor period, Cambodian history was depicted as the period of decline. There was an attacks. There are many attacks from Thailand, from Vietnam, and during the Sihanouk era, there was also confrontations between Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. So if we look at the historical scholarship, it actually offered Prince Sihanouk a historical duty to lead the country to confront with leaders of Thailand and Vietnam to ensure Cambodia's survival, because it's always been the fighting with the neighboring country. The last key aspects of history writing during those years is the promotion of the monarchy as a unifying force for Cambodian political communities. So whenever historical writing was published, it always about how the monarchy was the core of the national community, the national politics, national culture, national history. So it's all about the monarchy, the royal lineage. So I would like to also highlight that at the end, at the later part of the Sihanouk era during the 1960s, there was a new trend of writing history of the country. There was an emerging theme which focused on ethnic essentialist historical approach. So as you can see, picture on the left, there was a initiation to promote the idea of Khmerization, meaning the promotion of Khmer language in public education. So that idea took place in 1967. There was an initiation to establish the Mon Khmer Institute to study religion, culture, language of the Mon and the Khmer and other ethnic communities within these broad ethnic groups. There are also history texts which not just talk about the monarchy, not just talk about great men or the king. There are also history texts we talk about, mass cultures, racial groups, different religions. So there was a new historiographical trends that took place during the 1960s. But political interruption occurred in 1970 because Sihanouk was removed from power in March 1970, and Lon Nol came to power by establishing the Khmer Republic. So the establishment of the Khmer Republic actually marked several key changes in collective historical imagination in Cambodia. So one of the changes is the promotion of anti-monarchy and anti-French leader as national heroes. A well-known figure by the name Hem Chiu, he was promoted as one of national heroes after Lon Nol came to power. So the rise to power of the Khmer Republic in March 1970 actually coincidentally reshaped the focus of the Khmerization and the Mon Khmer institutes. So initially, this institution was aimed to promote scholarly discussions about Khmer, Mon, and other racial groups, ethnic groups in the region. But political influence came in and reshaped the focus of this institution. For example, the Mon Khmer Institute was renamed the Khmer Mon Institute in March 1971 and became a key propaganda machine of the government. The new government promoted Khmer ethnic essentialism through the notion of Khmer Mon racial supremacy as opposed to other regional groups, especially the Thai and the Vietnamese. So the idea that the Lon Nol picked up these themes of historical imagination is actually aimed to cope with its own immediate key challenges. So one of the challenges is to reconstruct collective historical and cultural identity, which has been inseparable from the royal lineage and court culture. So this for the first time in Cambodian history that there is a Republican government. So in the past, they're always the monarchy, they're always king. So now we are the monarchy, we are the Republican. So the idea is to re-establish a completely new identity by promoting a completely different historical imagination. So the idea of picking up rest, the idea of ethnicity or rest to be the main theme is actually to challenge to the existing framework. The other key factors that the Lon Nol government chose this historical theme is because the lack of its own ability in the early years to consolidate territorial control over Cambodia. And you can see the map on the on the right-hand side, the Lone Nol government actually controlled a very small proportion of Cambodian territory when it came to power in 1970s. The rest of the territory was controlled by the Khmer Rouge with support of Vietnamese troops. So the idea of promoting the notion of ethnic cities is actually to draw support from area outside its own controlled territory. The other challenge is to transform the war, the civil war. So right after Lone Nol came to power, there was a civil war between Cambodia, between the Phnom Penh government and the Khmer Rouge government. So the idea is to transform the civil war into a racial and religious conflict between the Khmer and those who labeled as non-Khmer or non-believers, which often refer to Vietnamese troops and Khmer Rouge supporters. So these are the three, I think, the three main immediate challenges that the Lone Nol governments were facing. And the idea of using these particular historical themes is actually to cope with these challenges. Undermined by these challenges, the Lone Nol and intellectuals associated with his government invested great efforts to impose a belief about Khmer greatness in both historical and cultural terms. Lone Nol promoted ideas of the Khmer Mon racial virtues by exaggerating their skills in employing magical power, in healing and combat. Intellectuals who supported the regime reshaped the collective understanding through uncovering linguistic and cultural practices of the Khmer and the Mons, as opposed to the Thai and the Vietnamese. A prominent scholar of the region by the name Trân Nghĩa, he was the director of the Khmer Mon Institute, claimed in his book that those who spoke Khmer Mon languages were especially different from the languages of the Thai, the Burmese, and the Vietnamese. This argument is not entirely accurate, because there are studies saying that Vietnamese actually also have some linguistic linkage with the Khmer Mon languages, the language family. Trân Nghĩa stated that the decision to rename the Khmer Mon Institute was due to the fact that compared to Mons and the rest of other regional ethnic groups, the Khmer are the more important ones who have the largest population and lived in an independent, sovereign, and highly civilized country. So to this point in time, we can see that historical and cultural trajectories of scholars associated with the Khmer Republic regimes, the way they formulated historical narratives were closely associated with a broader political motivation of the regime. So when the Khmer Rouge came to power in 1975, a new theme emerged. So this for the first time in Cambodian intellectual history that Marxist-oriented history was put in place between 1975 and 1978, because in early 1979, the Khmer regime was overthrown by Vietnamese troops. So just a bit of remark here that the Khmer Rouge was also well known, was previously known as the Communist Party of Cambodia. And then during the regime, it called Democratic Cambodia. And then later on, it's well known as the Khmer Rouge, which came to power in 1975. Pol Pot's viewed Cambodia's long historical development based on his ruling party, CPK. So there is no public intellectuals debate during the Khmer Rouge era, as some of you probably know. So most of historical debate, historical writing was predominantly occupied on the state official documents. And I think some history texts which was published in the CPK's official publication known as Revolutionary Flag, they were written by Pol Pot himself. So it was many intellectuals was actually killed under the regime. So we talk about the writing, I think, of Pol Pot directly. This depiction is slightly similar to that of the Pathet Lao historiography, and subsequently the historiography of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, which placed the Lao People's Revolutionary Party at the center of national historical imagination, especially during its 30-year struggle for power between 1945 and 1947. Pol Pot divided the collective past into three major historical periods. The pre-CPK years, meaning prior to 1960s, the CPK's-led revolution period between 1960 and 1975, and the period after the CPK seizes of power in April 1973. So unlike previous Cambodian rulers who divided Cambodian history based on pre-Angkor, Angkor, and post-Angkor, so when Pol Pot came to power, this historical convention was replaced with a completely new periodization. Pol Pot was the first and the only post-independent reigning leader who applied Marxist concepts to the understanding of Cambodia's long historical development. His overall view of the collective past reflected several interesting characteristics, some of which are similar to those of Sihanouk and Lon Nol. First, Pol Pot's narrative heavily employed Marxist-oriented approach, with very little consideration over actual historical events or fragmented past. The way in which he treated the past was to emphasize the ultimate role of the CPK in history, even though during the time that the CPK didn't exist, Pol Pot somehow tried to draw the connection to his ruling party. So he actually didn't really care about what are the historical material suggested. So it's a very, how to say, top-down approach. Second, reading Pol Pot historical writing, the intention to distinguish his leadership from the rest of previous Cambodian leaders is clear throughout the narrative. However, it does not suggest that he attempted to completely break off from the 200 years temporality of national history by imposing the so-called year zero, as understood by some writers. Some writers like Francois Pouchou even used the term Cambodia year zero to describe the early period of the Khmer Rouge regime. In fact, the Khmer Rouge top leader never used the term year zero or Chnam Son. So based on my own experience, they never used that. Oh, when the regime came to power, now we start year zero. So they never used that to describe their regime or enforce it as the beginning of the years in a similar fashion carried out in as year one at the French Revolution on 21st September 1792. So we can discuss about this further during the discussion session. So the third important themes of Pol Pot's historical imagination is, although Pol Pot repeatedly proclaimed that his DK administration was much more successful than any eras in history, the Temple of Angkor was still the regime's focal point of success. Similar to Sihanouk's and the Lon Nol regimes, the Angkor temples were adapted on DK's national flag, featured in national anthem and currency. Pol Pot in his long speech in 1977, he stated that people all knew Angkor. Angkor were built during the era of slavery. We, the slaves, built Angkor under the exploiting class of that era for the happiness of their kings. If our people were capable of building Angkor, we can do anything. The speech suggested Pol Pot's aspirations for the Angkor infrastructures, which were seen as a symbol of accomplishment and national pride, as argued by Henri Loca and Anthony Burnett. These aspirations were key factors, among others, that led to DK massacre and brutality. because the regime carried out ideas of building massive waterworks, such as irrigation canals, ponds across Cambodia's countryside, inspired by those of the UNCLOS hydraulic system. So these are the four major themes that I wanted to show in this presentation, which chronologically arranged from the 1940s until the late 1970s. So now I would like to draw, a little bit on the larger regional implication. During the existing historical convention, for the Cambodian case, convention of royal lineage, great men, great temples, in Cambodia during the late 1950s, there was a shift, there was a change to explore ethnic linguistic themes, which I think marked a significant turning point in post-colonial intellectual evolution. In fact, these new epistemological trends was parallel to larger Southeast Asian nationalist historiography after the period of decolonization and nation building. Roughly from the late 1950s onwards, regional nationalist historiography inspired by Modernist and Marxist-oriented historical approaches began to take shape in the public sphere. Nationalist scholars across the region became aware of more diverse themes and approaches in the reconstruction of their collective past, which encompassed the notion of nationality, good citizenship, as well as broader social, racial, and economic perspectives. In post-independent Laos, for example, a national historian, Mahasila Veerawong, published an influential history book, History of Laos, which incorporates a strong sense of Lao national identity by comparing the Lao race to those of the Chinese. He emphasized that the Lao were one of the most ancient races of the world, which had known a wide range of splendor and progress no less than any other races of the same era. Mahasi Sila Veerawong's writing, according to Vatana Polsena's discussion, have significantly shaped a vision of the Lao nation by strongly relating Lao national identity to a myth of ethnic descent. In the Philippine case, there was also similar trained nationalist historian by the name Agoncillo. Agoncillo wrote a very influential book published in 1956 on the revolt of the masses. A few years later, he published another one known as A Short History of the Filipino People. So it was released in 1960. The book aimed to explore the history of Filipino people rather than the history of Spain and the Catholic Church. So there's a shift to focus on a larger cultural framework. In Thailand, we have Chit Pumisat's work. The most important one, it was translated into English by John Craig Reynolds. The Real Face of Thai Feudalism Today. It was published in 1957, concentrated on the notion of class exploitation in feudal society of the Thai past. Another prominent Thai scholar by the name Chatip Natsapas, his scholarship during the 60s and the 70s emphasized the themes such as economic classes, tax farmers, bourgeoisie, land tenure system, as opposed to the Thai royal nationalist history that emphasized kings or great men. In Cambodia, political suppression and censorship imposed by the Sihanouk government in 1955 prevented diverse perspectives of the collective past, especially Marxist-oriented historical thought, from entering the public spheres. But the regional modernist approaches parallel to those in the Philippines did take shapes in the kingdom from the early 1960s. As you can see, one book which I show here, in which several Cambodian scholars began to incorporate the historical development of the mass cultures, such as languages, religions, ethnicity, cultural practices in the historical discussion. The founding of the Khmer Republic and the emergence of political instability in 1970, to a certain degree, loosened the restrictions of the freedom of expression and publication, but the new Republican regime did not allow Marxist-oriented historical thought to be circulated within its controlled territory. New nationalist historical themes and approaches, still parallel to broader regional epistemological trends, remain restricted within and influenced by the political motivation of the colonial government until the time Pol Pot came to power in 1975. So by way of conclusion, I think the time is fine, so I'm going to draw a very quick conclusion. So my long talk, my presentation, I actually tried to map out the changes in post-colonial nationalist historiography in Cambodia. So the presentation started with the idea that local scholars try to historicize the state religion. Then I focus on historical knowledge production. The knowledge production produced during the Sihanouk period, which predominantly emphasized the role of the monarchy and Sihanouk's role in Cambodian historical imagination. Then I talked about the colonial regime, which emphasized the themes of ethnic essentialist historical approach. The last one is Pol Pot Marxist-oriented history, which took place in between 1975 and 1978. So the idea is to show you how local history scholarship shaped religious, social, political, and intellectual landscapes of each political regimes during the post-independent period. Another major intention is also to highlight how local nationalist scholars responded to global and regional historiographical trends, which utilized by local domestic scholars to produce an impact on local social, political, and intellectual landscape during the post-independent period. So I would like to stop here, and I will look forward to hearing questions and comments from Professor Ann Hansen as well as the audience. So thank you very much.
I see a bunch of hands up, and I'm not sure who was first, so there's a lot of questions, and I have one too. So, but I'll hold on to mine, and let's start. Oh, okay, Lawrence, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. First of all, thank you for that really insightful and inspiring presentation. I was wondering if I could draw you out a bit on your characterization of historiography during the Pol Pot period as Marxist-oriented, since the way that you're describing it seems to have none of the characteristics of a Marxist historiography. So it seems like the history is not based on the development of classes. There's nothing about dialectical materialism. So what makes the historiography during the Pol Pot period Marxist? And then I wonder also how you might compare it to Jit Pumisak's understanding of the development of classes during the feudal period, since he also includes an analysis of Khmer history as part of that.
Okay, thank you. Should I address the question one by one, or we collect a few questions first? Okay. Thank you, Lawrence, for very thoughtful questions. So there are not much discussion on Marxist historical discussion which took place during the Pol Pot regime. There are only a few texts. Those are very short ones, and those texts was combined into Pol Pot speech in 1977. So basically, it's only I think only one writer who wrote history of Cambodia during the Khmer regime. And the writer himself is not a scholar. The writer himself is a political leader, is a revolutionary, is Pol Pot, to be exact. So the idea of implying Marxist historiography is not in a very scholarly way, as you can see in the Thai case. So basically, Pol Pot used the term that, for example, he talks about people who built Angkor. So he portrayed them as the slavery, as the slave of the king. So then he keeps saying, like, during the post-Angkor, the monarchy utilize this slave in order to defend the monarchy, and then eventually they were defeated by the neighboring country, things like that. So it's a very brief discussion, the implication of some Marxist terms, but it doesn't mean you talk about the scholarly discussion which took place elsewhere. No, it cannot be compared. It's just a very political message. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask my question too, because it's somewhat related. Trying to think about the circulation of Marxist ideas in general during the 50s and early 60s. I think your idea, I'm interested, first of all, in your argument that Sihanouk was pretty successful in preventing Marxist ideas, historical ideas, from circulating. So I'm curious to know, how he did that, the different ways he managed to tamp down that discussion. But at the same time, he's increasingly promoting Buddhist socialism. So how does Buddhist socialism fit into that suppression or effort to suppress Marxist ideas?
There was a series of censorship imposed by the regime. For example, in 1958, there was a group of special committee in charge of inspecting any publication, any newspapers and book imported from Vietnam. So the inspecting committee was consists of official from the Ministry of Interior, official from the Ministry of Culture, some scholar of the Buddhist institutes. So they were in charge of inspecting any publication that was imported from outside. So I think this is a very practical term that the regime actually prepare some called restrictions that to prevent any Marxist historical writing or ideas to be circulated under the Sihanouk era. And so based on my own experience, I haven't seen any Marxist history writing that was published or circulated in Cambodia between the 50s and the 60s. So I explore the National Archives, the National Library, and I haven't seen one. So going back to the ideas of Buddhist socialist ideas, it has less to do with Marxist thinkings, because the idea is to mobilize the Cambodian mass under his leadership. The idea is to combine the so-called Buddhist socialists to the combination between Buddhist doctrines and culture of the mass without imposing Marxist thought in terms of it's just a political imagination, which in practice it has a completely different meaning. So the real ideas of this is to make sure that Sihanouk can stay in power. So I think it's a should debate by Milton Osborne, saying that even Sihanouk was trying to promote Buddhist socialism, he actually did not really understand Buddhist concept. he didn't really understand the Buddhist teachings. So I think it makes a lot of sense, because the real intention of all these political motivation is to make sure that he can stay in power, and those who against his regime was portrayed as traitor, as somebody who wanted to destroy Buddhism, as somebody who wanted to destroy the public interest. So I guess I didn't really give a very precise answer to the second part of the question, but this is the ideas that I wanted to let you know. Yeah, thank you.
We've got a number of questions that are coming in. So first question, what was nationalism like in Cambodia before and during the colonial period? So asking you to contrast the sort of nationalist history writing trends that you're seeing in the post-independence period with what nationalism was like before.
It's I think the question is quite broad, but I'm very happy to share some of my thoughts. During the colonial period, it's actually part of my my ongoing project on the politics of ethnicities during the colonial and post-independent period of Southeast Asia, because some earlier scholarships tried to display that the establishment of the Nagarawata newspapers in 1936 marked the turning point of Cambodian nationalist movement, the cultivation of the Angkor image, imagination of the glorious past, the efforts made by the French to turn the Angkor temple into national symbol of Cambodia during the 20 and the 30 marked the turning point of Cambodian nationalist movements. In my projects, I actually wanted to show that a racial nationalism took place in the pre-colonial period, because if you look at writing by intellectuals during the 19th century, the 1840s, the 1840, 1850, there was a very strong sense of being Khmer, was fighting against the Vietnamese and the Thai. There was a very famous writing by a Buddhist monk named Which. He depicted the moment where Cambodia was being invaded by the Thai, and then the Cambodian was trying to fight back by protecting their identities. He using many languages that can translate as a nationalist thought. And this idea, this pre-colonial idea based on racial nationalism, the term that I would use, evolved through the colonial and post-independent period, because during the colonial period, there was a very strong debate on how the French treated the Vietnamese over the Khmer. The French imported many Vietnamese rubber plantation workers to Cambodia. They employed many Vietnamese in the administration in Cambodia. So this made the local Cambodian unhappy. And it actually turned into a very provocative nationalist imagination among the Cambodian ruling elites. So if you look at the development through racial discussion, so it's a very long ongoing between the colonial and post-independent period. So I would like to emphasize that racial or ethnic nationalism took place throughout 19th and 20th century of Cambodia. That is one of the major themes of nationalist movement in Cambodia. In Penny Edwards' book, of course, it talks about how Buddhism came in, how the image of the Angkor as the national symbol came in. During the Sihanouk era, the idea of the monarchy came in. So that occupied the major themes of nationalist thinking during the first part of the post-independent period. And then when a colonial government came in, the idea of racial nationalism came in again, starting from 1970. Yeah. So this is the very rough answer to the question.
Thank you.
Hakunman.
So another question, complementary things. Let's see. Questions about your approach. According to your presentation, it seems that Cambodian historiography is leader-centric, worshiping the leaders or their ideology. My question is if there are any, whether there are any historiographies that challenge this dominant leader-centric version. Like in Thailand, we could see many pieces of Thai modern historiography criticizing the monarchy. So that's one question. Are there critiques, historical approaches that are critical of the monarchy or leader-centric models? Second, why did Pol Pot quite often bring his foreign visitors to visit Angkor? What does this imply? Great questions.
So the first question, during the 50s and the 60s, there is no direct challenges to the Sihanouk's leadership. So I must say, I didn't see any publication that directly challenges to Sihanouk. But after Sihanouk was overthrown in 1970, there are many publications which challenge Sihanouk, who no longer in power. So, but during the 60s, I would say there are some publications that did not talk about king, try not to challenge directly to the authority. At the same time, try to incorporate more of the mass cultures. So there are writings which talks about how Cambodian linguistic development evolved over time. There were publications that talk about how Cambodian incorporate different cultures from India at different circumstances. How Buddhism, how Hinduism evolved and influenced modern Cambodia, things like that. So this publication did not, did not talk about the king, did not talk about the leaders. It tried to talk about culture of the masses, but there is no direct challenges to the authority that I would like to emphasize that took place during the 50s and the 60s. During the colonial period, there are some writing which directly challenge the colonial government, because to a certain degree, the colonial government allows some freedom of expression and publications. So there were a literary work. There's a novel which talks about how famous anti-monarch figures removed the Khmer king from power, and he took power. And then that leader became very corrupted because he appointed many corrupt officials in the government. So the implication is to imply that the current colonial government actually has many corrupt officials. So I think these are very direct challenges to the authority, to the government, which took place during the colonial era. So there are some between 1970 and 1975. There are some writing which directly challenge to the authority. So the ideas that Pol Pot brought in foreign visitors to Angkor, I think it's allied to the point that I made earlier in my presentation. So his regime regarded Angkor as a national symbol and national pride. So this is a point of accomplishment. So he wanted to show, I think, that there are some accomplishment, there's some real inspiration that his regime wanted to reconstruct modern Cambodia, to like use it as a symbol of development in Cambodia. I think that is one of the intentions behind that. Another intention, I think, especially took place during the later part of the regime, because to travel from Phnom Penh to Siem Reap, you come actually across a half part of Cambodia. You come across different provinces. So there's some. So the idea is to generate an impression because rumors started to circulate it during the late 1970s that the regime killed too many people. So the idea to arrange people along the road, I think along the national road from Phnom Penh to Siem Reap to show that all people living in a better condition, they have better clothes, they have better food, they look good. So it's a kind of propaganda to let these foreign visitors to travel across Cambodia to uncle and then to generate a different impression about the regimes. So I think that would be another intention of this arrangement.
All right, we're bringing up Ben Anderson here.
Oh, okay.
So through the lens of Ben Anderson, to what extent did Sihanouk succeed in recrafting the public imagination of the nation in comparison with Pol Pot? And what are other key elements of continuities across these two periods, such as the choice to retain and link up with Angkor? Interesting questions.
Interesting question, and I'm not quite sure whether I can answer the question. So let me try. It's so the idea that Anderson's idea came in because during the Sihanouk era, it was the era that print capitalism or publication came in and became very widely available across different cities in Cambodia. So that's why it's allowed the state to circulate the idea faster and more effective to the public culture. There was the cultural radio came in. So infrastructure, railway, national road was built, more vehicles that allow Sihanouk to travel to different parts of Cambodian countryside. I think he was probably the first Cambodian ruler who traveled widely. I mean, who been to many places within the country, because earlier Cambodian kings did not travel that much. So they were printed, I mean, newspapers and everything. But the key point is that actually I included this part in my chapters, which I keep for my future AS panel with Professor N. Hansen in Hawaii next year, I hope. So I think Ben Anderson didn't talk about the idea of embodiment, because when Sihanouk employed the idea of print capitalism, tried to impose recreation the past in order to utilize it for his regime very successfully, he got very strong support from the Buddhist community. So these are the themes that related to Ben Anderson's discussion in his imaging communities. But the idea of embodiment, because during the 50 during the celebration of the 250 years anniversary of Buddhism, it was a very important momentum of public imagination in Cambodia, and I think across Southeast Asia, in the ideas that Buddhism become a very prominent role in in the promotion of global peace, in the idea of coping with global Cold War confrontation between the superpower. So there was idea of that. There are also ideas that when the 250-year anniversary arrived, many society would encounter disorder, fightings, bloody war that took place. So the idea was circulated in Cambodia very, very strongly during the 50s. So there was a rumor saying that there would be the arrival of the Thoma king. So the Thoma king is an imaginary Buddhist ruler who came to save Buddhism from declining and make sure that Buddhism would continue until 5,000 years. So the idea was very, strongly debated among Cambodian Buddhist intellectuals and scholars. Then there was a promotion that the Thai king was actually Sihanouk. So there was a book which explicitly explained that Sihanouk was the Thai king. So the idea of projecting the Thai king here is that actually Sihanouk was a Thai king who would restore Buddhism, would bring prosperity to Cambodia, would make sure that Buddhism will continue for 5,000 years. So I think this involves some kind of sacred or religious nationalism that Ben Anderson didn't talk about, and it actually related very closely to the mass imagination, because over 90% of Cambodian population were Buddhist. So when this debate took place, Sihanouk also utilized this idea to promote his legitimacy. So besides knowing as the king, knowing as state rulers, many Cambodians actually regarded Sihanouk as the Thai king, Buddhist imaginary rulers who carry a sacred duty to make sure Cambodia will survive. Buddhism, Buddhism will continue to exist in the kingdom for the next, 2,500 years. So I guess it's a bit long. But my idea is that this example did not come into the discussion in Benedict Anderson's book. So the second part of the question, something about uncle, which I don't remember. What is the question again?
Other kinds of continuities that from the Sihanouk period to the Pol Pot period, like patterns or trends in history making that continue in these two regimes.
Okay, thank you. So I highlighted that both Sihanouk, Lon Nol, and Pol Pot share the idea of inspiring uncle. So that is one pattern. Another pattern is the ideas of the notion of anti-Vietnamese, very strong among the Khmer Rouge, because Pol Pot's speech in 1957, so it took place during the time that confrontation with Vietnam became very severe, very strong. But Pol Pot did not point out explicitly that Vietnam was actually Cambodia's main enemy. But there was another publication, so-called the Black Book, which was published in late 1970, which portrays Vietnam as Cambodian historical enemy, as somebody who wanted to take over the country, to steal Cambodian land. I think this idea somehow shared by Sihanouk during the 50s and the 70s too, especially when Sihanouk was in confrontation with leaders of South Vietnam. So it was a very strong confrontation. So the idea of promoting hatred against the Vietnamese, I would say there is another themes that continued between the Sihanouk and the Khmer Rouge era. Other than that, I think these are the two major themes. Yeah.
Jinda, do we have time for another question? Because we have a really good question that came in.
I think we can take the one last question.
Okay, great. Okay. So you mentioned about racial nationalism and the notion of Khmer pride evolving over different periods, mainly constructed by the elites and the Khmer majority. And the question asks whether you came across any alternative voices or views of racial nationalism from the peripheries, or perspectives of ethnic minorities such as the Chams in the construction of Cambodian nation.
It's a very good question, but it's very hard to answer because the lack of materials. I think they existed. I think over time they existed. The Cham, they had their own political community. Also, ethnic Vietnamese in the country also have their own somehow political identities. So I would say, because I interviewed quite a number of Vietnamese who lived during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So Vietnamese, during those years, they actually also carry their own sense of political identities because they lived in Cambodia for many generations. Some of them didn't even speak Vietnamese, but they somehow feel threat from the Cambodian public because, as you see, anti-Vietnamese took place in Cambodia throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So I think because of this, there also Vietnamese military interventions, the presence of Vietnamese troops during the I think the early 1970s. So all these generate political pressures over Vietnamese ethnic communities. So they do have the sense of threatening, and somehow they try to integrate into the Cambodian public culture. But they also so many Vietnamese actually integrated into Cambodian society, while many other who lived in the floating village, they keep their own Vietnamese communities. And those people live they are on the move. They keep moving from one place to another because of security reason. So I think they are also, it's not really a nationalist, but I think it's community centric view that we have a particular ethnic identity in this country, and it is a threat that always happen both in Vietnam and in Cambodia. So these people, they live in fears actually, and many scholars call them stateless ethnic communities. So they share some certain degree of communal, collective thoughts, mostly regarding their safety as a foreigner living in a country which had a very bad relationship with the country of their origins. So it's not really a clear nationalist imagination, but it's a sense of community that took place in different segments, different communities, different parts of Cambodian society. Other ethnic groups, I think they exist, but there is no evidence that allows us to draw a discussion. For example, the Charai, they were studied by Sihanouk. I think they also have their own sense of community, communal imagination. But how did they emerge? How did they evolve over time at different political regimes? So I think it would be very difficult to map that out. Okay, not so precise answer, but I hope I address some of the questions, and the audience got something in return. Thank you very much.
This was really fantastic, Theara. I mean, it just makes me even more excited about the book. Can you give us any sort of sense of, like, when you're sending off the manuscript? Is it getting?
So I'm gonna submit the manuscript next month.
Oh my gosh! Oh, great!
So as I promised, I'm gonna finish it by summer. August is still midsummer, but I wanted to work on the manuscript on ethnic communities. So I wanted to publish 1 or 2 more articles. My collaborator and I, we drafted the manuscript, the articles, and we wanted to send out to reviewers and get them published. So the one on racial nationalism. So I actually wanted to address the earlier discussion on how nationalism came to establish in Cambodia during the colonial period, and how it's impact the political regime afterwards. So I wanted to kind of address to this point by showing that there was a notion of nationalism based on race, based on Khmer race, which took place during the 19th century, the pre-colonial period. And this racial nationalism evolved through the 19th century into the 20th century. So by using different Khmer terms, different terms that we can identify as a nationalistic terms, things like that. So I'm very excited with this work, and I want it to be published so that people can discuss about it further.
Right, really
Yeah.
timely.
But the manuscript will be sent out, I think, to the editor next month. Yeah.
Great, congratulations, and we're all going to be looking forward to this. So thank you so much. Really, that was fantastic.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I hope you learned something, and I hope to catch up with you in the near future. I actually plan to travel to the US. I got my vaccination, so yeah, maybe early 2022, going to see Bob in Boston.
And
yes,
Hawaii. So
yes, that is important. So I work on it. So don't worry. We're gonna meet up in Hawaii. That is, I think, that was the soonest one. Then next summer maybe see you in Wisconsin maybe.
Wonderful.
We'll see. Right. Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you. Thanks
Thanks
everyone
again.
for coming.